I'm going to try and do basically three things. First of all, tell you something you pretty much know, I think, but maybe in a systematic way, that we're at a very interesting time in terms of early childhood development, where there is unprecedented attention to it. Secondly, especially from the education perspective, which is the one I come from, talk about the challenges that face both education in general and specifically the educational aspects of early childhood development. And then thirdly, try and deal with this question about what might we do about some of these challenges as a community. And as Mihaela mentioned, many of those questions that you just played around with on your app are designed to get you to start thinking about some of the topics that I want to talk about. First of all then, and as has already been stated, very importantly last year, the Sustainable Development Goals did include, for the first time, early childhood. And I don't think we can underestimate that. And included it not only in general terms, but also in specific terms with particular indicators about, especially about preschool coverage and so on, but also, actually this list is not complete if we included thematic indicator 9, also about earlier issues to do with parental stimulation and so on. So this is pretty important that we, globally speaking, we now have a global goal that includes early childhood. Secondly, one of the major reports around education, the Global Education Monitoring Report, it used to be called the Education for All Global Monitoring Report, but now in line with the shift towards the Sustainable Development Goals, has renamed itself the Global Education Monitoring Report, is paying increasing attention to this subject. And we also can see some pretty important movements. Pre-primary education is now compulsory in 50 countries, whereas only a couple of years ago, that was only 40. So we heard Lithuania is one of those. But that's a pretty impressive shift. And secondly, we should not think that all is terrible. Yes, there are many, 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 many children who are getting insufficient access to programs of ECD programs. But it's also the case that a very significant majority of the 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds in the world are developmentally on track. Sorry, not in the world, but even in the poorer countries, the low and middle income countries. So this is very important. We should not assume that everything is terrible. Not at all. Things are moving in the right direction. And that Global Education Monitoring Report also makes a very strong case for investing in early childhood care and education. Then, as we just heard last week, and as we'll hear more of during this conference, the Lancet special report on early childhood development, yet another important indicator of this growing interest and attention to our subject. I won't, of course, attempt to summarize that report because you're going to have special sessions on it, but I just note a few things that it says. Points out that because of poverty and stunting, a quarter of that the loss of average adult income per year for the 250 million children in low and middle income countries who are at risk of not reaching their development potential is something like 26%. They point out, in line also with the growing compulsory nature of preschool, that also there's an important shift in terms of policies. Policies, of course, are not the same as implementation, but still it tells us something pretty important, that in this century, basically, the number of countries which which have multi-sectoral ECD policies, has gone up by 61, gone up from a base of almost 0, actually, to 68. And also some very important things that report points out, which again, I'm sure we'll hear more about the possibilities for adding things on to existing programs, adding very important things on to existing programs at very low cost per child. So that's another important milestone, I think, in terms of this increased global attention to early childhood. We also have the ECD Action Network that the World Bank and UNICEF have announced, that we perhaps still need to know a bit more about what that is going to consist of. But it is another signal that this topic is getting increasing attention. And finally, there is the recent report of the International Education Commission, chaired by Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister, with which I had something small to do. And this also, well, it is about all of education, not just, of course, about early childhood. It actually is making some pretty strong statements around at least the formal educational parts of education. It's calling for 2 years of pre-primary for every child in the world. It's calling for closer coordination with other sectors, which in our context here certainly means with those concerned with what goes on in child development before even pre-primary. And it's calling for this important, the application of this important principle of progressive universalism, which I'll come back to later on in this presentation, but basically one in which it is important to use public finance, which is, as we've heard already this morning, probably inadequate and scarce, but at least to use what you have to start at the bottom and to increasingly then try and make the public finance available as you go up the educational system. But the crucial point being that the first thing you should do with your public money is the early childhood programs. So that's a very strong recommendation from that report, which I'm not sure has been fully realized by those who have been talking about it because of its broader attention to other aspects of education. So these are important reports, but they're of course just reports. It's also, I think, significant to see what's actually going on in the world. And I make no attempt to be comprehensive here, but I just draw to your attention, a wide range of different countries that have recently done something pretty major in terms of introducing or expanding early childhood programs or policies or frameworks. As I say, I'm not going to go into many of the sessions here. We'll go into some of these or similar things. The important point is there's a sort of movement, there's a kind of wave of activity. And we can see that also when we look in terms of enrollment in preschool or in pre-primary. We see that globally, this enrollment has actually gone up. This was one of the questions you may remember in the warm-up. This has gone up globally essentially 1 percentage point a year this century. So gone up from 30% in 2000 to 44% in 2014. So that's pretty significant progress. On the other hand, if you continue at that rate, it's going to take 56 years to get there globally, which is probably rather longer than any of us would want. And this is also, of course, not so straightforward when we look at it in a disaggregated way. We can see that regions such as the one we're in now, of course, has got very high enrollment rates, 70% or so, whereas in Africa and South Asia, we're just around 20%. So so we have made a lot of global progress, but some parts of the world have really got a long way still to go. Similarly, in terms of spending, globally speaking, the median public spending on primary education is about 1.5% of GDP, gross domestic product, whereas that on pre-primary is only 0.2% of GDP. Now you would not expect them to be the same, I don't think, because primary does take many more years, of course, but it is still striking how different they are. And this again is very, very different when we look at it in a disaggregated way. So, and again, also it comes out, of course, from looking at this spending data, the regions which really basically don't do anything around, for pre-primary, which is Africa and South Asia. And even East Asia, not a huge amount. So we've got this contrast between the fact that there's a lot more attention, which must be welcome, between the fact that there's a lot of progress, which must be welcome, but there's still an awfully long way to go, especially in certain regions. But even in all regions, there's important distances still to go. And we see this again, another piece of spending data, making the same point, that the expenditure you might expect, because a very young child probably needs more adults to pay attention to her or him than does, say, a primary school child. You might expect that spending on the pre-primary level might even be higher per child than at the primary level, but in fact it's certainly not. It's about half what it is at the primary level, even in the places that do spend on pre-primary education. So again, we have important things that still need attention. Let me now turn to the global challenges. In a way, I've already presented one challenge, that we've got a lot of progress, but we've still got a long way to go. But what about these specific challenges, these specific things which affect us currently in these times of rapid change, as the conference title is? Well, the first, which is within education, which is absolutely crucial, is the global learning crisis. The fact that even though children may be in school, they are not necessarily learning adequately. And again, one of the questions which we had in the warming up session, on present trends, unless we all do something, about half the 1.6 billion children and youth who we will have in 2030 will not be able to achieve the basic skills of a secondary education. Half. That is really a lot by 2030. The date of the Sustainable Development Goal, the target date for the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is, of course, as you would expect, more acute in the low-income countries than in the middle-income countries, where it is still much more acute than in the high-income countries. It's really actually very serious in the low-income countries. In the low-income countries, we see that only 8%, less than 1 in 10, 1 in 12 children will actually be achieving full secondary skills by 2030, unless we do something. Unless we do something. Or many things, of course, unless we do many things. Inequality has already been mentioned, and it is a crucial issue, an absolutely crucial issue. It's important to remind ourselves what we're talking about, though. Actually, inequality, because of the huge increase in income levels in countries like China and India, actually global inequality, if you look at the total distribution of the world population, global inequality has actually gone down. Equality has actually improved for the total world population. But the problem is, within countries, equality is worsening. Inequality is increasing within countries. So in OECD countries, such as we're in today, it's at its highest level for the last 50 years. In developing countries, income inequality has increased by 11% in just the last 20 years. So these are very serious, very, very serious increases in inequality, here measured in terms of income, but there are other ways, of course, we could measure that, and they would show the same sort of patterns within countries. Although, as I want to repeat, globally speaking, inequality has actually declined. But of course, the political units in which we live are still largely individual nations. And this is where the tension is coming up. We've also got the issue of inequality within education. And the issue of quality of education within education. Among primary school students in low and middle income countries, the top quintile, the top 20%, among the top 20%, 54% will learn the basics. Now think about that. That's a pretty worrying statistic. We think that the elite are going to be okay, but actually, among the top 20% within the low and middle income countries, only half are learning the basics at primary school. And of course, for the poorest 10%, only 1/3 are learning, sorry, the poorest 20%, only 1/3 are learning the basics. This is pretty serious for both groups. Now, of course, and it's even more serious than it sounds, because this is just for those who are in school, of course. To get into this data, you have to be in school. And then there are all those children who are not even in school. So, it's not just, so there are two important issues here. One, the quality of education, even for those who are from affluent backgrounds. And secondly, the differences between those from affluent and poor backgrounds. Gender dimension is well known, but we must never forget it. Twice as many girls as boys never start school. Even though we appear to have rough parity in many countries in terms of actual enrollment, this is a more complicated thing because it also has to do with those who drop out and the out-of-school populations. But one of the key points is that twice as many girls as boys never start school. Children living with disabilities in developing countries, about half of them are not in school. About 33 million of the 65 million children in that category. And what about early childhood education programs among 3 to 4-year-olds? Well, again, big differences between rural and urban children. So we've got not only the global inequality issues that everybody is so concerned about, but we also have massive equality or inequality issues within education. Unemployment. Here we are in the European Union, where the average youth unemployment rate currently is, we could have had that question, about 20%. 20%. I think Lithuania are doing a bit better. Maybe what, about 15% here, something like that. But France, 25%, Spain, Italy, Greece, I can't remember exactly, but in the 40s. So I mean, this is today. If we now look at what projections we have for the future, and just think about the numbers, and think not only about Europe, but more broadly, increasing unemployment seems very unlikely, again, unless we all do something. We've got 1 billion more youth entering the job market over the next decade. Already, 1 in 3 of them are not the so-called NEETs, not in education, not in employment, not in training. basically unemployed. This number could rise. This represents, of course, as many people are frequently observing, not just an employment issue, but it threatens social stability, it threatens political stability, it threatens security, and so on. This is a huge issue. It's linked to skills. It's not only skills. We have to accept that the reason, not all the reasons for unemployment are because people are not well prepared to enter the workforce. Obviously, there are other reasons, and that some of those other reasons are important here in Europe. But nonetheless, the preparation of people is one of the key issues. And again, most projections show that something like half of a generation will not have the skills that the labor market will need by 2030. Again, the target date for the Sustainable Development Goals. So a lot of thinking needs to go on about what skills people need. Why? Because this is an area of really rapid change, especially due to technology. Already we think about half the jobs we currently have won't exist, even in 15 years' time. Those that will exist will require more skills, higher skills than currently. And all of this in the context of this massively increasing numbers of people joining the workforce, especially in the poorest countries such as in Africa. Sorry, I went the wrong way. So we could end up with a major shortage of skilled workers. We could end up with large numbers of people still living in extreme and absolute poverty, and we could end up with even worse income inequality. So it's not a very rosy picture in terms of employment. And employment, having a job, is of course the most important single thing in terms of getting out of poverty. Migration, very hot issue here in Europe, but globally also. Expected to grow to something around 400 million the number of international migrants. This is quite aside from internal migration, which is very important within countries in Africa, within India, and so on. With an increasing share of that due to conflict. These data include internally displaced people as well as refugees. But whether it's economic migrants or it's conflict-driven migrants, migration is a huge issue, which when combined with the youth unemployment, again, really threatens the fabric of our societies. It's important also to look at this within education. Something like almost 40 million children have been forced out of school by emergencies. Something like a quarter of all the children who are not in school are in conflict-affected countries. Something like only 1 in 8 of the children in emergency situations are being reached with any type of support in terms of education, and so on. So this whole migration and conflict issue is another crucial one that we need to deal with. Economic growth itself. Of course, we had the Great Recession, but we're now out of that, but we're hardly out of it at the levels we used to be. So the world as a whole is growing at something like 2.5%. Countries such as those here in Europe are growing around 2%, not all even that. Developing countries, as always, doing a bit better than richer countries, but the world as a whole growing much, much more slowly, and apparently going to continue to do that than it was at least before the Great Recession. I mean, the whole argument among economists about whether we're in a low growth sort of situation permanently or not. Whether we are permanently or not, we're certainly at least in a mess right now. And so this combined with all the other issues means that there are many fewer resources available to meet the educational needs, including the ECD needs. So this Education Commission estimates that, at least for low and middle income countries, you need to approximately triple spending on education over the next 15 years. And there's a background to that in terms of getting everybody into school, in terms of spending for more efficiency and so on, which I won't go into now. But the point being, very large increases in spending in education are needed at a time when economies are not growing as fast as they used to be. Final challenge is, which is perhaps a more difficult one to exactly specify, but clearly there's some sort of well, I don't know clearly, I think, there's some sort of decline in political capacity. What do I mean by that? There's some sort of decline in the ability of political systems to solve problems. So we see increasing either polarization, such as within the US, where basically, issues can't get resolved, or similarly here in Europe, the inability to deal with many of these issues, such as migration or the role of the euro or economic growth and so on. That these things have, the political systems are very unable to tackle many of these things. And this, I think, actually, by the way, has an important link, which we'll come to early childhood. Why? What is that link? Well, in order to tackle these issues, you have to be able to compromise. You have to be willing to compromise. You have to be willing not to insist that you are always right, or that your solution is the only possible one. And those, of course, that ability to compromise is, of course, one of the key social skills that we hope children will acquire in early childhood settings. So let me now turn, actually, to the question of what does all of this mean for us, the early childhood community? What should we do? And we had some impossible questions for you as part of the warm-up, which the point wasn't really to, though it was quite interesting what your answers were, that nobody actually thought that, on the one hand, you all thought the advocacy was inadequate, but nobody thought that advocacy was the first or second thing that people should focus on. So that was sort of interesting. So, but that must mean, therefore, that you think that some changes are needed in the advocacy, and I would argue that too. I think we also need to think about funding. That may be less of an issue, perhaps, in a country like this one, or even in Europe, but it's certainly an issue globally. The case for funding for education and then the case for early childhood funding needs to be made in terms of the competition for funds. So it's not sufficient simply to say all the good things that stem from these programs. We've got to be able to compete with the infrastructure lobbies for public spending, with the health lobbies and so on, and they are very effective. And so we need, I believe, much more speed, we need to move faster, and we need to be much more specific, not general. Just saying ECD is a good thing is not going to do it. So I want to argue that there are three things we ought to focus on, and these were sort of implicit in some of those questions you were asked when you were using the app earlier on. I think we need to adapt our advocacy. As many of you, it was interesting that about 60% of you thought it needed, were dissatisfied, whereas 40% were satisfied. So that's actually, I would sort of understand that, because I think that we've done a fairly good job, but now we need to adapt it further. We need to do something about multi-sectoral approaches, which was also very interesting that was one of the top two things that people were talking about. And we need to focus on practical implementation, which we can come and discuss what we mean by that, but clearly things like workforce, which you collectively thought was the most important thing to deal with, is one of those things. So what about adapting the advocacy? I haven't seen this film that's going to be shown here, so I don't know what it says should be done now. But clearly the advocacy so far has been based upon really two things: science, the basic neuroscience, and basic economics of investing in very young children. And all of that's good, and that should not be dropped. But given the issues that the world now faces, should we not be putting more attention now into this point about the link between life skills and work and political capacity? This is a very interesting graph drawn from the work being carried out at the Brookings Institution in collaboration with the Lego Foundation, showing that the type, although it's just for the United States, it will increasingly apply, it would apply to other countries also, that the type of routine tasks are becoming less important in the labor market, and I would argue also in the political context, whereas non-routine ones, both analytic and interpersonal, are becoming massively more important. So isn't that something we ought to be talking about? That the skills learned in early childhood settings actually are very much the ones that are needed in the workforce. Isn't that an argument we should be making? The equity point also, given all this inequality that we've been discussing, shouldn't we be hammering even more on the social justice angle of ECD programs? Of course, we are already making that argument, but perhaps we should be using it even more. I mean, as our favorite Nobel laureate, Jim Heckman, is always saying, there's no other investment which both gives you a good return and social justice. But perhaps we should be hitting the social justice argument harder. There's a particular example in terms, of course, of why we need these programs for children from poorer families, because in this case, just shows you the difference in terms of their access to vocabulary. Another area we may want to pay attention to is multi-sectoral approaches. So it's very interesting, this Lancet, and again, I think I'd like to hear more from those who are going to be presenting it. But clearly, one of the things that's evident there is the need to link nutrition and health programs much more with parental programs. I think that's an important point that is coming out of that, and it's clearly a correct point, and it's one we need to pay attention to. There's another point which is actually getting a bit lost, I think, in all these reports, and we ought to be paying attention to. There are those who are very concerned with pre-primary, preschool. And there are those who are, or among you, those who are very concerned or principally concerned with the first 1,000 days. But there's a bit of a problem, there's a gap there. Who is concerned with the 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds? Who? Or even the 5-year-olds in some systems. And are we sufficiently paying attention to the whole of the 0 to 8 age group that we have, roughly speaking, all agreed upon as the target group for early childhood programs and policies? I would think not. So I think this multi-sectorality and also gap filling, which I put under this heading because I couldn't think what other heading to put it under, needs to be an important aspect of what we talk about and what we do. So that one straddles both advocacy and action. What about practical implementation? Very interesting. Very few of you were interested in data on that survey. Well, that is probably an unfair statement. None of you thought it was the highest priority. But a lot is still needed. Maybe, again, not so much in countries like this, but in many countries we have desperately inadequate data. We need a lot more data. We also need to change the way we evaluate things. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that from a program that actually my Institute, Results for Development, is involved with in India. So how do we typically evaluate things? You know, we use some sort of a gold standard program thing like randomized control trial. We take a group of children who are in the program. We take a group of children of similar children who are not in the program. We wait 5 years. We compare them. And we see what happened. And then we find it worked, great, we apply it. Or we find it didn't work, okay, we have to stop that approach. Wouldn't it be better if we could adjust the program as we go and make sure that it actually works, or in most cases works? Well, clearly it would. So there's a whole sort of movement now, which I think that this community needs to adopt more than it has so far, towards what you might call, or what some people call, adaptive learning. It doesn't really matter what language we use, but it's more real-time evaluation. But using rigorous, it's not the same thing as monitoring. Monitoring is a management tool. This is going beyond that. It's using more real-time evaluation, not just before and after type evaluation, more real-time evaluation, in order that you can try and adjust your programs or the subparts of your programs when you find that they're not working, or that they're not working as well as you might like. So I think that's an important area that our community might want to pay more attention to, as well as the already well-publicized need for much better data at the national level. Workforce you were all very interested in. One of the interesting things in the Education Commission report is a comparison between the health and education sector, pointing out that there are all different types of jobs in the health sector and not really in the education sector. I'm not quite sure what I think about that for primary or secondary school, but I'm pretty sure that this is a correct remark with regard to early childhood programs. And we ought to be thinking much more within the workforce about differentiating the tasks and having different, more specialized people for the particular tasks, which also reduces the load on any one type of person. And of course, we have, one thing I might mention is that we're together with ISSA, the sponsor of this conference, we at Results for Development have put together this early childhood workforce initiative, which is basically designed to pay attention to these type of issues and to be a joint learning exercise among countries and practitioners and so on who are interested in improving the workforce, because the workforce is obviously the key to quality in early childhood. And there's a session on that this afternoon. Not many people voted for finance, but I think we had better do something about it, because we don't know the answers to these first two questions. We don't actually know what different early childhood programs ought to cost. We don't. And only in a few places do we actually know what they do cost. We probably know here in Europe, but in many, many countries we don't know. And so we need to get answers to these questions, because if we're going to go, it links back to advocacy, but it also links to practical implementation. We can't ask for money for something unless we can specify what we're going to use it for. And for that, we've got to know what things cost. And in order to apply this progressive universalism principle that I already referred to, which I think is crucial and should be a crucial part of our argument, we need to know what things cost. And simply put, we don't. So a lot of work is needed there. Perhaps many of you are not involved in those sort of questions, many of you perhaps just conducting programs, but it is really striking how difficult it is to get data on what things cost. Just look at that Lancet report, which is an excellent report, but it's pretty thin on that sort of data, and that's not its fault. That's because there isn't such data. Also, another small point I want to make about financing. It's often suggested that innovative financing, which we have worked on, again, I've worked on quite a lot, can be an important way to finance early childhood programs. I don't think so. We don't think so. It can be an important way to supplement resources available for such programs from the public sector, yes. So certainly I don't dismiss the idea. But I think we're deluding ourselves if we think that we can fund early childhood programs out of these type of innovative financing programs, even though they have their value and they have their place, and even though I am involved in some of them, such as some of the social impact bonds I'm quite involved with. But nonetheless, I don't think that they are the main answer, and we should be careful that these things don't divert us actually from making the basic argument, which the progressive universalism provides about the base should be publicly funded. So I'm almost at the end. Well, in fact, I am at the end. My basic message, or messages then, to you are, I think, are the following. One, that we have actually made enormous progress. The advocacy has been paying off. There's huge gains in the world. But two, these gains are insufficient in themselves, and especially in light of the particular issues that the world as a whole faces, the particular problems of migration and inequality and low economic growth and so on. And three, that as a result, we need to change some of the things, the way we do some things. And I've suggested some of the areas that I think we need to change, ways we need to adapt the advocacy, ways we need to deal more with the multi-sectoral nature of our work, and ways we need to get much more practical about things. Because I repeat, we're in a competition for resources. However good our advocacy, unless we can also couple the advocacy with proper analysis and proper specification. Specificity is important. Specification of what we need extra resources for. What would we do with those resources? How will they be used? Unless we have that, we are not going to win the struggle for difficult to obtain public finance. But with those arguments, there's no reason I can see that we shouldn't win those arguments, because people in general are very keen on young children, to state the very obvious. But we're in a very strong position if only we can get ourselves to be more specific and not just use rights-based arguments, which I haven't touched upon, and which I think have enormous value, but which I don't think are getting us anywhere with regard to specific competition for resources. For that, we need to focus on these things like workforce and finance and data. So, thank you very much.